James Scott Garner dismantled the Hollywood studio system by wielding forensic audits like a combat weapon. The Oklahoman actor replaced the myth of effortless charm with a survivalist architecture forged in the blood-stained ridges of the Korean War. Domestic tyranny and public humiliation in women's clothing catalyzed a lifelong defiance against corporate hegemony. Why did a twice-wounded veteran risk a career to expose $9 million in creative accounting? How does a garlic-scented ambush in the 38th parallel explain the birth of the modern reluctant hero?
Norman, Oklahoma, 1928. The air carries the metallic tang of red clay dust and the low-frequency hum of incoming tornadoes. James Scott Garner was born into a lineage defined by the 1889 land rush, a heritage of Sooners who claimed existence through raw grit and systemic self-sufficiency. But the architecture of his own childhood was fractured before the foundations could even settle. At age 4, the zero point of his identity arrived. His mother, Mildred, died from complications following a botched medical procedure. This left a structural void that his father, Weldon, attempted to fill with the numbness of alcohol and a succession of increasingly volatile stepmothers. The most piercing anomaly in his development was a woman named Wilma, or Red. Her tenure was a regime of domestic tyranny. She didn't just use physical force, she utilized the mechanics of public humiliation as a tool of psychological control. In the definitive record of his life, The Garner Files by James Garner and John Winokur, Garner recounts a pivotal moment where Red forced him to wear a dress in public as a form of punishment. This wasn't merely a childhood scuffle, it was a calculated attempt to strip him of his personhood. The ridicule he faced ingrained in him a lifelong systemic resistance to being the focus of amusement against his will, a trait that would eventually manifest as the bone-dry, protective wit of his cinematic persona.
The domestic vacuum finally imploded when Garner was 14. Following a violent physical confrontation with Red, a fight for literal survival where he was forced to strike back to keep her from killing him, the family unit shattered. Garner left home permanently, becoming a self-sufficient drifter in the wreckage of a post-depression economy. He discovered humor not as a source of joy, but as a functional defense mechanism, a penchant for intelligence over violence. He learned to navigate the world by sensing the flow of power before it could crush him. But the lessons of the Oklahoma Crucible were about to be tested on a global scale. While the red dirt taught him to survive a household, the frozen ridges of the 38th parallel were about to teach him how to survive an empire. By 1950, Garner was a drifter modeling in Los Angeles, but the systemic gears of the Cold War were already grinding into motion. He became the first Oklahoman drafted into the Korean War, an anomaly of timing that placed him directly into one of the most brutal meat grinder units in American military history, the 5th Regimental Combat Team of the 24th Infantry Division. The 5th RCT was a unit frequently used as fodder to stuff up the gap, a military euphemism for high-attrition replacement squads sent to stabilize collapsing fronts. Garner's 9 months in active combat were a masterclass in primal survival. On just his second day on the Korean peninsula, shrapnel from an enemy mortar round tore into his hand and face. This was the zero point of his military career, a baptism in blood that shattered any remaining illusions of romantic heroism. Yet the true catalyst for his survival was a refined sensory hypervigilance, a direct byproduct of his traumatic childhood. While on night guard duty, Garner caught a faint atmospheric whiff of garlic on the wind. Recognizing the scent as a signature of the diet of North Korean and Chinese troops who lived on rice, fish heads, and garlic, he passed the word down the line. His unit was ready. They stopped the enemy patrol in its tracks.
The physical toll culminated on April 23, 1951. While diving headfirst into a foxhole to escape a strafing run by a U.S. fighter jet, Garner was hit by friendly fire, sustaining phosphorus burns and shrapnel wounds to the upper leg. Despite his bravery, the systemic failure of military bureaucracy meant he wouldn't receive his second Purple Heart for another 32 years until a televised inquiry on Good Morning America forced the Army to rectify the clerical mix-up. Garner returned home a decorated veteran, but his worldview was forever hardened. He had survived the scrounging and the scarcity of the front lines, a skill set he would eventually use to breathe life into the scrounger of The Great Escape. Garner didn't enter Hollywood seeking art. He entered it as a combat survivor looking for a paycheck. His lunch bucket approach to acting was the logical endpoint of a man who had already seen the reality of the 38th parallel. But to turn this survivalist instinct into a cultural icon, he needed to study the quiet clinical intensity of a man named Henry Fonda.
Maverick's refusal to engage in the stereotypical shootout at the OK Corral wasn't just a comedic gag, it was a radical, systemic restructuring of the American masculine ideal. While contemporaries like John Wayne were refining the warrior archetype, a figure who never lets evil go unpunished, James Garner was building something far more intellectually complex. He introduced the reluctant hero, a man who viewed the frontier not as a site for manifest destiny, but as a treacherous landscape requiring a specific kind of mental agility. As explained by James J. Turner in his research paper, Tales of Rationality, this phenomenon is known as the Rational Emotive Behavioral Monomyth, or REBM. Unlike the traditional monomyth popularized by Joseph Campbell, which focuses on the external conquest of a monster, the REBM framework positions the hero's journey as a process of individuation, the Jungian transformation of becoming a whole self by resisting the suffocating pressures of the collective. Garner's characters were not driven by honor or vengeance. They were driven by a fundamental desire for autonomy and the moral and ethical consequences of their own choices.
This was the ultimate anomaly in the 1950s cultural landscape. While the prevailing social hegemony demanded domestic containment, the white, middle-class focus on the nuclear family, Garner's Bret Maverick offered a radical bachelor masculinity. He was an outsider who prioritized his own survival and a deck of cards over the era's intense focus on heterosexual domesticity. He was a lovable cad who would rather sneak out of town than participate in a bloodbath, a character whose dry wit charm functioned as a protective layer against the conformity of the masses. This academic framework explains why Garner's resonance was so enduring. He wasn't just playing a part, he was embodying a catalyst for a new American identity, the rational actor who navigates a broken world through intelligence rather than violence. He transformed the Western from a triumphalist myth into a post-Western interrogation of what it means to be an individual within an exploitive system. But as the 1950s faded, this on-screen defiance against the collective was about to crash headfirst into a very real, very legal war. The reluctant hero was about to find himself in a courtroom, staring down the very studio that had made him a star.
The paradox of James Garner lies in the radical disconnect between the man who made cowardice charming and the man who became the most dangerous legal insurgent in Hollywood history. On the flickering screens of the late 1950s, Bret Maverick was the master of the tactical retreat, a gambler who would sooner sneak out of a back window than face a high-noon showdown. But inside the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Burbank, James Garner was the only man willing to pull the trigger on a legal bullet that would eventually shatter the old studio hegemony. At this precise moment, Warner Bros. Operated not as an art house, but as a ruthless industrial factory. The architecture of the television business was a high-volume, low-margin machine that rotated actors like Jack Kelly and James Garner into a relentless production cycle to meet the systemic demands of the broadcast schedule. In 1956, the studio had signed Garner to a 52-week contract that paid him $1,250 a week, a pittance for a man generating millions in advertising revenue. But the true irony surfaced in 1960 during a massive writer's strike that threatened to paralyze the industry.
Warner Bros. Attempted to deploy a legal mirage known as force majeure, a casualty clause designed for acts of God or war, to suspend Garner's salary without pay. They claimed they were materially hampered by the strike and could no longer honor his contract. It was a fundamental exercise in corporate suppression, using a strike as a catalyst to bleed to talent dry. However, the survivalist hypervigilance Garner developed in the red clay dust of Oklahoma allowed him to see through the facade. He didn't just wait for the strike to end, he sued for total breach, initiating the landmark case Warner Bros. Pictures, Inc. v. James Garner. The investigative truth revealed in the law books is startling. The court discovered that Warner Bros. Was not actually prevented from producing films. They had plenty of scripts and were merely using the strike as a financial loophole. On March 10, 1960, the judgment was handed down. Garner's contract was terminated. This wasn't just a win for a single actor, it was a systemic blow against the vertical integration of the studios. He had won the legal shootout, but as he transitioned into the 1970s, he would find that the industry had other ways to extract a price, not from his wallet, but from his physical biology.
Inside the trailer, the air smelled of stale coffee, salt water, and burnt rubber. By 1974, James Garner had pivoted from the high-stakes poker tables of the frontier to a mobile home parked on the fringes of a cynical post-Watergate Los Angeles. The show was the Rockford Files, but the visual language was something entirely new, Malibu grit. While other 1970s detective series like Kojak or Hawaii Five-0 existed in a world of polished suits and institutional authority, production designer Richard Hoover created a look for Jim Rockford where the concepts of inside and outside were conflated.
The set was textured with wooden interiors, horns, shells, and nature drawings, all filmed through dark yellow and brownish filters that gave the screen a bruised atmospheric weight. But the most authentic element of this architecture wasn't the lighting, it was the physical decay of its lead actor. Garner brought a lunch bucket work ethic to a production schedule that was systemically designed to break a man. He insisted on performing his own stunts, most notably the Rockford J-turn, a high-speed reverse 180 that required precise, bone-jarring execution episode after episode. He engaged in gritty, unchoreographed fistfights that prioritized realism over Hollywood flash, often filming in high-adrenaline wheel-to-wheel racing sequences. To the audience, he was the indestructible everyman. To the medical record, he was a structural failure in progress.
By the final season in 1979, the reluctant hero was operating on a foundation of agony. Garner's knees had been repeatedly pummeled from years of fight choreography without a stunt double, leading to chronic inflammation and eventual full replacements. He suffered from chronic back trouble and a bleeding ulcer, the physiological byproduct of being in almost every scene while navigating a toxic, high-stress relationship with Universal Studios. The human cost of the everyman was a man who required 18 months of separation from his family just to recover from the sheer atmospheric pressure of the set. The paradox lies in the studio's response. While Garner was literally breaking his body to deliver a hit, NBC and Universal claimed the show was generating a deficit of several $1 million, a staggering anomaly for a top-rated program. The studio viewed his medical collapse not as a tragedy, but as an expensive inconvenience. This lack of empathy was the final catalyst. Garner walked away from the trailer in 1979, but he wasn't retreating. He was merely repositioning his forces for a war against the very math that tried to erase his profit.
In the Alice in Wonderland world of Hollywood finance, a hit television show isn't a gold mine, it's a mathematical mirage. By 1980, the Rockford Files had completed 100 episodes and was entering a massive, lucrative syndication cycle. Yet, when Garner's production company, Cherokee Productions, asked for their 30 to 40% share of the net profits, Universal Studios responded with a staggering claim: the show was currently operating at a $9 million deficit. To the average observer, this was impossible. To the studio, it was the standard architecture of creative accounting. This was the deepest layer of the industry hegemony Garner had been fighting since his first skirmish in 1960. Universal utilized a suite of sophisticated fiscal maneuvers to ensure that on paper, a hit program never technically made a profit. Studios frequently deduct negative costs, the total price of production, along with massive distribution fees, advertising surcharges, and surcharges that act as a black hole for revenue. They factor in the depreciation of the property while only listing actual assets, essentially writing off costs in perpetuity to drain the pool of available profit. It was a systemic effort to decouple the success of the artist from the success of the product.
Garner, fueled by the same questioning attitude toward power he developed in the red dirt of Oklahoma, refused to stay silent. He took the battle into the public sphere, appearing on 60 Minutes to expose the industry's hidden math. The retaliation from the establishment was swift and personal. Sid Sheinberg, the president of Universal's parent company, MCA, publicly labeled Garner a crybaby, noting the actor had already been paid $5 million in salary. But for Garner, the money was secondary to the systemic principle. He was the first major star to go public and fight a net profit battle to its bitter conclusion, refusing to set foot on the Universal lot for nearly a decade. The war lasted 9 grueling years until both sides reached a confidential settlement in April 1989, with Garner reportedly receiving $14 million. This victory proved that the net profit trap could be dismantled, allowing other creators like Roy Huggins to piggyback on the results and secure their own shares. But as he dismantled the corporate architecture, Garner was already seeking an escape from the scripted world entirely, finding a new zero point where the variables were objective and the stakes were physical.
In the Alice in Wonderland world of Hollywood, every variable is manufactured. The walls are plywood, the sunsets are painted, the emotions are practiced in front of mirrors. For a man like James Garner, a combat survivor who had already navigated the visceral, unscripted terror of the 38th parallel, the cinematic mirage was a paycheck, but it was also a profound psychological anomaly. He required an environment where the variables were objective and the stakes were governed by physics, not by studio accountants. He found it at 120 miles per hour, strapped into a vibrating cockpit, where the only narrative that mattered was the raw mechanical truth of the engine. The catalyst for this escape was the 1966 filming of Grand Prix.
While contemporaries often utilize stunt doubles as shields, Garner, under the clinical training of racing legend Bob Bondurant, discovered a legitimate hyper-vigilant talent for the track. He caught the bug bad, eventually forming his own team, American International Racers, AIR. This wasn't a celebrity vanity project, it was a high-intensity industrial endeavor. Garner acted as a hands-on owner, managing crews and sponsoring cars across diverse platforms, from Lola T70 coupes at Daytona to Chevrolet Corvettes in Endurance Series.
However, the pursuit of truth reached its peak in the Mexican outback, the brutal, unscripted vacuum of the Baja 1000. Visualize the texture, the blinding red dust of the desert, the deafening roar of a 650 horsepower Ford Bronco, and the acrid metallic smell of hot oil and scorched rubber. In the 1969 Nora Mexican 1000, Garner piloted the Goodyear Grabber, a radically modified Oldsmobile 442 built by fabrication ace Vic Hickey. He was leading his class by nearly a full hour until the environment struck back with flat tires and oil failures. In Hollywood, a failing engine is a plot point. In Baja, it is a life-threatening crisis. Garner didn't call for a cut. He nursed the wounded car over the finish line to nab second in class, proving he was a pioneer of extreme sports decades before the term became a corporate slogan. Racing provided the ultimate antidote to the studio hegemony. On the track, his name meant nothing to centrifugal force, and his salary could not negotiate with a blue gasket. This was the space where the reluctant hero could find a velocity of truth that the factory system worked so hard to obscure. Yet, even as he spent his life chasing the unscripted reality of the desert, one constant anchor remained: a 57-year partnership that defied every toxic stereotype of the industry he fought to change.
In a town where identity is often a disposable commodity and relationships are built on the shifting sands of public relations, James Garner maintained a foundational architecture of personal stability. If the entertainment industry is a vortex of transient connections, Garner found his bedrock in a 14-day whirlwind. On August 17, 1956, exactly 2 weeks after meeting Lois Josephine Fleischman Clark at a poolside barbecue, the couple married. This impulsive union defied every established social hegemony of the era, surviving for 57 years until Garner's death in 2014. This wasn't a manufactured Hollywood fairy tale. It was a systemic anchor that allowed him to survive the atmospheric pressure of fame. However, the internal mechanics of this partnership were not without their own tactical retreats. Garner and Lois navigated 2 significant periods of separation, a 3-month hiatus in 1970 and a more protracted 18-month break in 1979. Crucially, investigative records indicate these gaps were not fueled by marital discord or the typical infidelities of the elite. Instead, they were systemic responses to the extreme physical pain and studio-driven stress Garner endured during the production of the Rockford Files. He retreated to a rented house in the valley, not to escape his family, but to recover his own humanity from the wreckage of a grueling schedule that demanded he be in almost every scene.
This same adherence to fundamental integrity extended into the political theater of the 1960s. While modern celebrity activism is often criticized as a form of epistemic power used for branding, Garner operated under a citizen-first philosophy. On August 28, 1963, he flew to D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He wasn't there as a proxy for a collective identity. He sat 3 rows away from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the I Have a Dream speech because he found it fundamental that basic rights were still being denied a century after the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't seek the podium, he sought the presence of truth. In his late career masterpiece, The Notebook, Garner's portrayal of an elderly man's unwavering devotion to his wife was not just a performance, it was the organic culmination of his own life's architecture. He brought an unforgettable realism to a character defined by memory loss, mirroring the integrity of a man who spent 8 decades refusing to let the system erase his sense of self.
James Garner lived by a simple rule: be on time, know your lines, and tell the truth. From the red dirt of Oklahoma to the battlefields of Korea, he learned that the only way to survive a broken system was to stay true to yourself. He wasn't just an actor playing a reluctant hero, he was a man who fought real wars against the powerful and won. Whether he was suing a studio for fairness or standing up for civil rights, he proved that one person could change the game just by being honest. He left behind a 57-year marriage, a list of legendary roles, and a legal legacy that still protects artists today. James Garner showed us that in a world of fake smiles and corporate math, the most powerful thing you can be is yourself. If the system asks you to trade your integrity for a paycheck, what will you choose?